I'm Matt Carpenter.
And I'm Peg Keough.
Welcome to the College Podcast. We are going to be your ultimate guides and helping you figure out how to navigate this maze in such a way that you don't lose your minds or your wallets. Let's get started. Okay, Peg, lots to talk about this week. How are you?
I am good, as usual. Lots and lots and lots going on. Fun
Before,
times, everybody.
before we dive in, you have a lot going on too. Do you care to share or no? Do you care to share about what you got cooking on
I'm
your
in the
home?
process of getting my house ready to sell, so that's fun. I'm not even in my own house right now, so
Wow.
never a dull moment, but it's all good. That's one of my mantras. It's all good. And that's a good one for our audience, actually. It's all good. It's all gonna work out through all of this crazy stuff we're gonna talk about today. We're here to guide you and to give you insights and maybe, not maybe, I know we're going to give you some peace of mind and reduce some stress. So it's all good.
So you and your husband are like the Department of Education. You're just blowing it up. We're out of Seattle. Let's blow
I
this. Let's
know.
blow this thing up and go from that climate to a different one, right?
Yep, exactly.
Okay, so look, we're going to do our best to stay on track today. I'm sure we'll go in a couple different directions, but we'll kind of start with the overall State of the Union. This kind of talk of completely disbanding the Department of Education. We did that largely last week, but there's been developments since there. Continues to be every day. Specifically, what we're calling this Dear Colleague letter, which we will talk about. Kind of start there first and those implications. Then we'll move on to how is that going to impact borrowing for college loans, right? What are we seeing already? What are we seeing on the horizon? Pros and cons around that front. President Trump made an announcement that any colleges still giving COVID tests had 14 or requiring COVID tests had 14 days to change that, or else they would not be eligible for federal funding. We'll quickly touch on that. There's not a ton to talk about there, but it's certainly noteworthy. And then we just want to talk about what is some of the fallout. I don't know if that's the appropriate word, but or what are some things that are happening as a result of some of these changes, this reduction or freeze in NIH funding. Specifically, we're actually seeing some things, some dominoes fall at college campuses, and we're going to talk about those. But for starters, Peg, I think it makes sense to talk about this dear colleague letter that
Yeah,
I can
give
kind of.
give some highlights for our audience because some people might have read it, but maybe not everybody knows what we're
I
referencing
hope
here.
nobody read it. I hope nobody read it. For their sake, we have to do these things. Although it wasn't too. It was easy enough to follow, and it wasn't too long. But this was a letter sent to basically everybody in education in the United States. Now, again, Peg and I stay in our lane in terms of talking about higher education, but this was sent not just to colleges and universities, but also all K through 12 school districts from the acting assistant secretary for civil rights in the United States Department of Education. That's Craig Trainer. Okay. Now, essentially, what this did, I would say, in short, there was a ruling that you may have been familiar with that happened in 2023, and that was the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, where ultimately the Supreme Court ruled that you cannot use race as a factor, indicator, whatever you want to say when determining whether or not to accept or not accept a student. Okay, what the Republican Party is doing right now is saying, look, we have a more comprehensive interpretation of this ruling. And number one, here's where we're going to focus kind of our interpretation. Number two, we're going to enforce it. In their mind, it hasn't been comprehensive enough, and it hasn't been enforced. So, for example, they're saying, you can't use students' essays or their writing samples or their participation in extracurriculars to determine their race. Okay, you cannot use race as a means of giving financial aid or scholarships. That is no longer allowed. And another one that I think is important and interesting here is that it is unlawful for an educational institution to eliminate standardized testing to achieve a desired racial balance or to increase racial diversity. This is interesting because it's not clear to me. Does that mean that these institutions have to require standardized testing, meaning the SAT or the ACT, Or are they just saying, hey, this can't be determined as a mechanism to try to glean a student's race?
Well, and even that little piece right there is funky because I know tons of kids, like my daughter, white Shannon, like she was a good test optional kid. There wasn't test optional back then. So that's not some of these things, it's like that might help the population that the legislation and the lawsuit was about, but it helps tons of kids of all different backgrounds. So it's not cut and dry at all how this will work. It's fine for the Republican Party to say we're going to do this, but I'm reading it and just scratching my head like, what? This isn't, there aren't things that are always specifically targeted to what the legislation was talking about. There's a lot of ambiguity in there.
Agreed, right? I mean, and they said some of the legal specifics is going to follow because there's tons of, to your point, vagueness around this, and I think a few different ways it can be interpreted. Just like the Republican Party said, the Democratic Party didn't do a good job in their interpretation or enforcement of this original ruling, and we're going to come clean that up. And that's kind of what this letter was all about. So I'm just kind of curious, Peg. I mean, and certainly you can tie it to this specific letter here, but just give me some of your overall thoughts, reactions, etc., in terms of what we're seeing in this space, collectively on the whole.
I mean, the pendulum is definitely shifting, inside the Beltway in DC to it's not inclusiveness and targeting certain groups, right or wrong. I mean, it's not technical to say this, but it's nutty. It's nutty what's going on, and neither one of us are lawyers, but I don't get how this plays out when you have a law and it's interpreted a certain way, and then politicians who have a certain agenda, and that's true for Democrats too. They all have an agenda. The president has an agenda. They decide to interpret this in their way. What I think is going to happen is the courts, as always, through all of these things, are going to get involved, and it's going to slow everything down. Um, Sometimes it's interesting to look at all these things we're going to talk about today and just say, hey, what's the worst case scenario here? And then play back from that if you're a person that falls into this group and you're trying to figure out how it might affect you. Worst case scenario, like to you, what you're talking about, Matt, is all these different ways that the colleges, help different kids of different groups. um they could all go away. What I think colleges might start doing is getting really generic in how they give out scholarships. It'll just, the names, everything will get super generic. So then they're following the law, but they're still cutting the cost of college. They're still discounting, which, if you're familiar with this is what all the colleges are doing, and they've been doing it for years. They've been cutting the cost of college by tens of thousands of dollars into six figures for families for years. So that's what I think it's going to start getting to be. How do we follow the law, but we're still cutting the cost of college, and we're still getting our students in the door and the deposit checks in the door. That's what I think is probably going to end up happening. It's going to be a little tricky because I think there's going to be oversight from the administration to make sure these colleges are following what they think. If it doesn't get challenged in the courts and the court says, nope, you're interpreting it wrong, it's actually the first interpretation, and now you're taking it somewhere it doesn't belong. You're being too broad in your interpretation.
Yeah, I'm largely in agreement with you. I mean, but I will say, and if we zoom out for a second and just look at this from a meta standpoint, and I said probably some variation of this last week because I haven't, because I still feel the same way. And look, this is a system that is broken, right? I mean, this is and I think, some of the spirit of what the administration is doing, I think I fully support because and again, I'm being a mind reader here, but I think they're saying this is crazy. Okay. Colleges are $100,000 a year now. All of them collectively, of course, they're not all $100,000 a year, but they are all outpacing inflation, right? Which is, saying something. And
They
we
have
have
been for years and years
they
and
have been
years.
they have been for years, and we have $1.8 trillion in student and parent debt. And now the college degree collectively is a little bit less valuable, right? It doesn't guarantee employment or meaningful employment right away, and so it's kind of like it in some ways. I like what they're doing and saying, you know, we're going to hit the pause button here because, and we want to stare at this and figure out how to right some of these wrongs because clearly it isn't working. I would say my biggest problem, and so that I appreciate, and I'm on board with. My biggest problem is, and I think the process of how this is communicated is what I would like to see differently, right? And it comes with, I think, a lot of kind of scary language, and we know a lot of families and students that are like, "Oh my goodness, is the rug going to get pulled out from underneath me? Am I going to lose this scholarship that I'm already on? Am I not going to be? Are my loans not going to be forgiven? Am I going to be able to get a loan?" Right? As opposed to just if there was my wife's therapist, Dina Bacon, right? I've seen her a bazillion times. We've seen her a bazillion times together. One of my biggest takeaways from her was like, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. It's the process. And I think if it was communicated of like, look at, hey, we're not liking how this is working overall. And we want to pause some things and take a really close look and see if we can help make this better for more people. Who couldn't get behind that and say, and we're sorry if you're going to be, you know, suffer some short-term pain and be a little bit nervous about some shakeups here. We're with you. We're trying to make this happen.
Yeah, yeah, I 100% agree that the way it's been shared across the board, it's like bull in a china shop a bit. You know, the other extreme is analysis paralysis, and you never get anything done. And then there's a medium of, okay, what's really happening if we want to talk about the Department of Ed specifically, what's happening in here, who does what, what's valuable, what maybe where is there waste and of come at it that way. And then to your point, the messaging to the public, the messaging to the voters is just better instead of this, instead of how it was done at Twitter, right? It's just, and even this, and we're not going to talk about this, but I'll just make this statement, just treating people with dignity in a process too. That's just something that is falling by the wayside here. So to your point, it just makes people not be able to sleep at night, and rightly so, because it's just you want to wake up and what's the next bomb that's dropping today that might affect my child or my family. So, you know, hugely good points.
And
I agree with the messaging 100%.
and I'll tell you, you know, in terms of the actual some of these bullet points that we hit on in the beginning of potential impact, I had spoken with a few of our colleagues that are in admissions and in financial aid, and specifically talked about, hey, should students and families be worried if they're receiving a scholarship that is, you know, tied to a certain race or ethnic background, et cetera, or if for families that were hoping to pursue some of those opportunities, should they be worried? They were actually less concerned than I was, and they said they've had workarounds with this, and it's kind of commonplace in college where they essentially call it a scholarship matching process. That was their terminology, where there has to be certain metrics that the student has to hit, right? And in terms of GPA, test scores, extracurriculars, etc. And then they can match those. So long as they do that, they feel like they kind of check that box of like, okay, this is we're not just deciding this scholarship based on race, for example, and then they can go match it with their preferences in terms of, again, race, ethnic backgrounds, etc. So I can't pretend to be an expert there, but that was how it kind of was explained to me. And they were essentially like, we're not really worried about that. Maybe to your point, they have to get a little bit more creative in terms of the terminology and
Yeah.
what, you know, language
Creative,
they're
more
using.
generic, because the bottom line is the way college is priced ain't gonna change. They have these sticker prices and they start reducing it for all these families, so that's not gonna change. They're just gonna get creative slash more generic about how they do it. Yeah,
And let
that's
me ask
not
you this,
surprising
Peggy.
at all to me.
Are you seeing anything that would lead you to believe that how need-based financial aid, and maybe you can quickly explain need-based financial aid, but are you seeing anything that would lead you to believe that need-based financial aid is going to be impacted in any way here?
Well, the main thing, again, federal need-based aid, a big one is the federal direct student loans that all the kids do is submit their FAFSA and they're automatically eligible. There's a subsidized version of that loan, which the government pays the interest until 6 months after graduation. The minute this all hit the fan months ago, said to my husband, that could very much be in jeopardy based on what I see the philosophy of the current administration. And that's one thing that's coming out now. The whole loan program could be in jeopardy. That whole undergrad space where kids can get up to 27,000 over 4 years. The Parent Plus loan, it's called a plus loan now, but it's parent loan for undergrads, and also the Grad Plus loan. Those are all potentially in jeopardy. And then this all goes over to the private sector, which we talked about a little bit in the first episode. I mean, that's a whole nother can of worms, but all of that could be in jeopardy. But since we're getting to this piece, there's been tons of press about DOE is going to get shut down. The Department of Ed's going to get shut down. Oh, my loans are going to go away. There's no Department of Ed. No, that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is, and we've seen it with USAID, where they're talking about moving it under the Treasury or moving it under another department. So it might have a different name. It might be smaller as far as number of employees, right or wrong. I'm not making a judgment on that one. But do not think that your loans are going to go away. If you're a current student, you're a grad student, that is not a good bet. If you're starting to work with your child or you're a student listening to us and you're in high school, don't think, loans are going to be off the table. But certain loans that are beneficial, they may not be offered to you. We don't know that. That's very beginning murmurings that we're hearing. Our CEO talked to somebody yesterday and we got some kind of intel from a lobbyist. Hey, this is being thrown around. We will keep you updated, but in the loan space, it could change dramatically. I would just say take a deep breath. We don't know enough to give you concrete facts around it. Just keep that in mind that
And
could
let me
happen.
pause on loans there, Peg, because I want to come back and just kind of put a bow on this, our first bullet point here around this, letter from Craig Trainer last week. And if I'm to distill this down, and again, this is a little bit, I guess my interpretation, right? Some of this of like, okay, what are they trying to say here? There's a little bit of reading between the lines. And I think one of my interpretations was that, we want to give discounts for college and have it largely a lot of these discounts be driven less about, again, race, ethnic background, etc., more about this income, right, or income, lack of income, right? If we want to provide financial aid for families that have less resources, and I can get behind, again, the spirit of that, because if you are, the son of a Saudi prince, yes, I guess you're a minority, but do you have less opportunity than a female in rural Appalachia that's, incredibly poor, right? Probably not, right? So that's where, again, if that's what they're hoping to cut through or whatever, I guess I can understand that. And again, maybe that was one of my kind of positive interpretations there that I could, again, at least kind of get behind and say, like, okay, if that's what we're trying to accomplish here, that makes sense. Again, I'm not in love with how it's communicated, but okay, fine. And I think we can understand that. And outside of this loan piece, I don't see any way that need-based financial aid is going to change. And I do think that it's the families that have the least amount of financial resources that need the most help, in making this college dream happen here.
Yeah, because need-based aid is that, colleges have their quote unquote business plan, we like to call it, about how they do need-based aid. And you have a certain amount of need, we meet this much need. Yeah, there's some subjectivity there, but to your point, it doesn't fall as much under what they're talking about making changes to. So yeah, I
Yes.
agree on the need-based front.
So just to kind of reiterate here and getting to our kind of second major talking point here is loans, right? And what is going to happen in this loan space. We've seen a few things. I focused big time on one last week, which was Betsy DeVos saying, "Hey, the federal government shouldn't be involved with loans here. That should be Wall Street. That should be private banks and lenders that should, like it kind of used to be, should take over here." Which again, that could mean we didn't, or at least I personally didn't think that would mean the federal student loans. Although it appears that's on the table. Those could be eliminated or reduced. To your point, Peggy, the subsidized loans, no interest during college, are probably very likely on the chopping block, is what we're hearing here. And the plus loan, so um, the parent loan program for the federal government could be reduced, it could be going away, and same thing for grad school. There's a grad school plus loan. But what why don't you explain what the plus loan is a little bit more, Peg, and just kind of your talking points around that? I know you're kind of more anti than you are pro. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but talk about the plus loan a little bit and how it impacts the broader landscape, I would say.
Yeah, so the plus loan, which I still call parent plus loan, the old name, that's basically offered to parents and on a financial aid award letter from the colleges saying, "Hey, your delta, meaning we cost 60, here's all the aid that we're giving the student. Oh, there's still 30,000 left. No worries. Here's your Parent Plus loan. Just apply." And this is through the government. It's very easy to get, very easy. And I won't tell story after story of people that I'm shocked actually get it. So people are getting it that in the private market
Let
would,
me bust in though, Peggy, because I think some of them are worth sharing, right? Like we've seen parents that are literally unemployed be approved for the plus loan for $80,000,
yeah,
right?
and
Or
that's in a year. Like you're applying for that year of school. And so it allows the colleges to say, "Hey, all your costs are covered." But they're loans. A ton of it is loans, and people don't think, I got to multiply that by four. I got to put all this interest compounding in there. They don't think like that. And that's a big part of the 1.8 trillion that you're mentioning at the beginning when we hopped on here. So I know there are some spaces where this might work, but also it's much easier to get. It's much, you can get approved with a subpar credit score, whereas in the private market, they might say no, or they might have an absurd interest rate that most people would just say, "Okay, I'm not that crazy. I'm not going to take out a loan at 20%." So it allows people to get themselves into some pretty major trouble. And to your point, Matt, it truly is predatory lending in certain circumstances that you and I have seen over and over again. And so that's my main thing that I don't like it, because I want people to make affordable decisions. There's thousands of colleges in this country, and you don't need to do that. So I wouldn't be super sad to see that loan go away. There might be kids that just don't go to their dream school, but it's okay. It's okay because they're going to go somewhere else and be happy and impact the world in whatever way they are. So, but that's the that plus loan. And then grad school, I mean, most grad students, depending on what you're going to study, you're going to take out loans. And that's just part of how it works unless you have a fellowship or something. But that's the plus loan. It's very different than the student loan, the federal direct student loan that's offered that has a cap. That's a loan that is usually the best place to go. If that truly goes away, that's going to be sad. That's going to be very sad, for
yeah,
a
I'll
lot of
be
families.
bummed out if that happened. But to your point, and I'm a little bit more on the fence about this, the plus loan. But here's one potential very positive impact of the plus loan going away. So let's play this out. Let's say it goes away. Now the hardest part about it going away for me, I think, will be the fact that for some families, it's the only loan they would qualify for.
Which I would
Or
argue maybe that means that school is not affordable and they have other options. I'll
well,
just
listen to
say
where I'm
that.
going here, right? Because right now, knowing that just about every borrower is at least going to qualify for the plus loan, unlimited amount every single year, colleges have no financial incentive to curb their pricing
Yep.
at all. because the federal government is just going to, just like we've seen, be a runaway train and feed anybody that can't afford it. No problem, you get a plus loan,
Yep,
right?
exactly.
And that has, you could argue, been the biggest culprit for feeding these insane, college costs, right? If that goes away, and a family has to make a decision where either I am completely denied the loan, or I get a loan, and to your point, it's 20%, which it that's a real number, guys.
Mhm.
That's a real number that it could be if you're barely qualifying here. I think that will really cause more people to say, you know what, as much as I want to send my kid to the dream school that they earned to go to because they got accepted into, that's too much, right? I can't
Yep.
look
Yeah,
past.
9% like the plus loan is now versus 20. That's a very different conversation within a family. Yep.
So that could actually be something if we're not just going to just green light all these uh, families to take out this plus loan. Um, I just think I could see large percentages making different decisions, right?
Yeah, and if it affects the college's yields, then they have to get together behind the scenes and say, okay, what are we going to do here? We're not meeting our yield targets because there's no parent plus loan for these parents to basically have the zero at the bottom, which isn't zero. And yeah, that's a great point. And it could slowly but surely change the pricing of college, really.
I mean, that is one, again, place that I arrived and I said, huh, intentional or not, that's like a real possibility for an
Yeah, and I
outcome.
think it's very unintentional, but it's a great potential result, I
Yeah, it
think.
is, and
Yeah.
again, that is I appreciate the disruption there. So, I don't know that there's a ton to talk about in this next point here in terms of, there there was another announcement made last week that any colleges that are still requiring COVID tests, and there was about 15 in the country thereabouts. The colleges had 2 weeks to remove that, or else they weren't going to be eligible for federal funding. And I don't know if I said this at the top. I don't think that I did, but that is the biggest threat that these colleges are facing if they don't comply, right? Because essentially, unless you're, the Harvards of the world that have these insane endowments, you require federal funding to stay open. Okay, it's a very important part of the business model, essentially. So these colleges are going to comply. Some of the schools that are still requiring the COVID test. Just to quickly rattle off a few here. I know it was Oberlin, Swarthmore, some of these, kind of liberal arts, really excellent institutions, by the way. How do you pronounce it? Bryn Mawr. It used to be the
Yep, Bryn
Bryn
Mawr.
Mawr, right?
Yep.
Haverford, right? Spelman was one of the schools, right? HBCU school. Franklin Pierce up in New Hampshire. I thought that was a random one. Now, admittedly, this kind of quick study that I saw said some of these could just be the colleges don't have their websites up to date, right? So,
Because this is a minor thing
yeah,
to say, okay, all right, it's not like COVID is raging and like it was, years ago, thank God.
yeah,
As far as people ending up in the hospital and on vents and all of that. But the overall, if you don't do this, federal funding will go away. The colleges they got to listen to it. And maybe in this space, it's an easy fix potentially, but we'll see. We'll see what comes down the pike with other threats of this sort. It could hit much, much bigger, and they could have to make some pretty major changes
it'll
if
be
you don't want to
interesting. To
lose
your
the
point, I
funding.
don't see not a ton to talk about here. If they haven't all already, I'm sure all those colleges are going to drop that immediately, and you just got to, that's that, right? So I don't see anybody digging their heels in there. Again, we'll keep our eyes on it, but I think that's more of a distraction in terms of the headlines here, and having material impact like a lot of these other things we're talking about certainly do. To that point, Peg, and kind of last thing that we'll hit on here is what are some of the dominoes we're seeing already, specifically with this NIH funding being frozen or reduced, et cetera, and two of the campuses that have showed up in headlines already. Actually, Peggy, we got Wash U out in your neck in the woods,
No,
and the
I
old
know.
stomping
I know.
grounds,
Wazoo. Go
the
Cougs. Yep.
the
Yep.
the old stomping grounds in Rutgers, but Wash U, they're an interesting one where they're saying, hey, look, until we know what's going on here, we're doing a hiring freeze, and and making some other pauses in terms of their development plans. And Rutgers, I guess, comparable in the sense that they're saying, hey, they had, well, maybe you can speak to that, Peggy, because you took a
Yeah,
closer
they
look.
had NIH funding to build 2 research buildings, and they're not building them right now. Like there's a stoppage on that because the funding has been abruptly stopped. So these kind of things, NIH, you would think, oh, that's all medical, but obviously the research Rutgers was doing is medically related, so NIH is funding it. They're a big funder of this for universities and colleges. So it's just going to trickle, all these different things trickle down. So the colleges are same thing. They're waking up every day. Okay, what's going to hit the fan? How do we respond to this? There's just a lot going on in this space. But those are 2 examples of funding. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
and when I
interesting.
see what Washington State is doing, when I read that, I'm like, awesome. Like that should make you feel like that's a responsible school that's getting ahead of it. I mean, I'm a financial planner by background, so I'm like, hey, they're getting ahead of it. They're not digging their head in the sand. So it's not a bad thing. If I were a parent still paying for college, like I was years ago, that would make me feel good that they're jumping on this, right? It's a little unsettling to see it, but they're trying to deal with it very proactively. So kudos to Washington State for that. So
Yeah, my conspiracy theory take on the Wash U one was, I'm like, I wonder if they're
it's
just
not Wash
struggling.
U, buddy. It's not Wash U. That's the one in St.
Oh
Louis.
yeah, what do I got to?
Wazoo. It's a little bit
Wow.
different. Wazoo. I only know that because I live out here. Yeah.
I'm sorry, guys out there. Sorry.
Yeah, it's just because I live out in
Well,
Seattle.
they have one of my favorite alumni of all time, Drew Bledsoe. But I was like, this would be an excellent opportunity for colleges that are struggling a little bit to just say, like, blame all these changes here. Again, that was my conspiracy theory hat. We'll see if some of those pop up here. Like, oh, we were doing great, but now with all these changes, we're
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
struggling here. All right, Peggy. Well, look, so given all of this, and obviously things are gonna continue to change every single day here. We're paying very close attention to it. But I'm a college bound, student or parent of a college student, or maybe I'm an educator that's trying to help these students. Like, what can I do? What should I be doing? Given all these external things that I have little to no control
Right,
over.
right. So, key takeaways here. Know your student aid index. And if that's something where you're scratching your head, go to our website, collegeaidpro.com. We've got tons of information and we're going to talk about it. So we're going to guide you on that. You have to know what the colleges think you can pay for school. So know your student aid index, know your budget. And I know people cringe, they don't like that word budget. Know what you can afford, and I'm stealing this from my buddy here, Matt. Control the controllables, right? There's so much going on that you could just be staring at the ceiling all night. Like, take a lot of deep breaths, know what you can control. The rest of it, let go. Those 2 things you can 100% control. So that will give you some peace of mind. Even if you're getting into this world of like, I hate numbers, trust us, trust both of us, 100% do that. That's going to really help you start to get some visibility into your family's situation. All this stuff is happening out here, there's all this noise, but you can control that. You can understand that.
Yeah, 100% right. And I echo everything you just shared. And again, I just kind of love the mentality of, so what? Now what? Okay, that's the
Yeah.
deal. Now what do I do with it? Right. And it's exactly what you said. I take ownership, I take accountability. Okay, no, maybe some scholarships go away. Maybe there's some different changes to what can I do about it? And to your point, I can know exactly how much these colleges are going to cost my family before I go even tour that campus, right?
Yep.
I can
Ideally,
figure out
that's the timeline. Yep.
I can figure out how much I'm going to have to borrow because maybe my budget is zero, right? Your budget may very well be zero or close to it. Fair enough. And by the way, you're not alone. Okay. So there's zero shame in that. But if that's our reality and collectively we're going to have to borrow all of this, we need to know exactly what that's going to look like. right? And not just because it's not going to be college is going to cost $25,000 a year. When we look at all the interest we're going to be paying back, we did an exercise as a team a little bit earlier today, and we looked at an example where borrowing 100,000, which is not a crazy amount today, ultimately we were paying back 230,000. So we need to just go look out into the future, right, and put ourselves in a position to succeed regardless of what happens with all these changes, external changes that we can't help, right? And that's and to me, and that's the takeaway, right? So I hope, my kind of, again, hope is that a lot of people are like, you know what, I this is an unpleasant thing that I've been kind of putting off, but now I have to pay attention. Like and now is the time. So I hope that's another kind of positive benefit that we get, that a lot of parents and students are like, I have to pay attention because stuff's clearly happening here. So,
Yep, yep. Two simple things. That's our big takeaways for today. So,
all right, Peggy. Well, I will see you in roughly 2 minutes. But for this week, we'll
yeah. See you next time.